Hi, Ian. Welcome. Thanks for joining us as we dive back into the book of Revelation. As a church, we've been hanging out in Revelation 11 and 13 between the two witnesses and the two beasts, and now we're looking at chapter 12. And so, as we dive in, this seems to be a bit of an interlude like Revelation 7 and 10 were. What do you think the purpose of this interlude is in the book of Revelation?
Well, Dustin, first of all, I'd like to say it's great to be with you, and I'm sorry I'm not with you in person. We have just such fond memories of lovely people, amazing scenery, and crazy weather. So we hope to experience that again one day.
Well, the weather hasn't changed, so.
Yeah, this is really interesting because it's fascinating when you read different commentators on this text. And the one thing that every commentator agrees, it's really nice to find in Revelation one thing that everybody agrees to, and that is that at the end of chapter 11, at the beginning of chapter 12, this is a major disjunction, a major change, a major sort of hinge point in the text. And it is roughly halfway through. I haven't counted up the verses, but it is kind of halfway through as well. And we can see that. I mean, I hope one of the things that, as you've continued through Revelation, one of the things you've noticed is that actually part of reading the text carefully is noticing what I guess I would call these literary or narrative markers. So the words that John uses, the phrases, the devices. And of course, most of the way through the visionary part of the text, we've heard him say, and I saw, and I saw, and I saw, and I looked and I saw, and I heard, and I saw, and I heard, and so on. And here it's really striking that in 12 verse 1, suddenly it's very different. It says, and there was a great sign in heaven. Now, that does several things for us. Just worth noting again, you'll have been used to all the stuff about counting words. The word sign actually occurs 7 times in the text, so just another thing to notice. Um, and of course, when John talks about and I saw, and I saw, and I saw, he's seeing cosmic things, he's seeing life on earth, he's seeing the heaven realities, but he's seeing them and he's testifying to them. Now, I think it's fascinating that he now is saying, and a great sign appeared in the heavens. And of course, the significance of that, particularly if, his readers are coming from a pagan background and they understand what signs in the sky are all about, this is something which is visible, this is public. So it's no longer him testifying to a private experience, but he's actually saying, hey, this is something cosmic significant that others can see too, in a sense. And this demarks it and says, okay, there's a change in focus here. There's something different going on. And the language changes and the imagery changes. There's quite a lot of discontinuity from chapter 11 to chapter 12, although an interesting connection as well, which we'll explore.
So I have a question particularly on that. And we talked last time you visited about just
Hmm.
this trying to sort out what does it mean that John had a vision? We're reading this vision. Sometimes commentators and interpreters will think of, oh, we're partaking in this vision, and that's a bit hard because John had the vision. We're reading his account.
Yes.
And well, it seems like there's this very factual language at the beginning of 12. We
Hmm.
then find that he immediately enters into the narrative of this ancient
Yeah.
pagan myth and
Yeah.
uses it as the narrative structure for his vision. So, what do you
Yeah.
think the dynamic is there between this almost factual, it's no longer seeming to rely on John's senses, but he's using this cultural myth from his own time period? How do you kind
It
of
is.
sort those things out?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that I explore in the beginning of my commentary, which I haven't found anyone else exploring seriously, is the question of, did John have a vision? Now, what I mean by that is that, as you say, what we have is a document, a text in its literary form. It is what's called a vision report, because he says, and I saw, and he's recounting this. Now, it's easy to, as an ordinary reader, simply say, "Oh, okay, so he had a vision, and all he's doing is describing this vision, like he doesn't participate in it at all. It's just as if he's transcribing, like a transcript from a YouTube video or something like
Yeah.
that." But of course, you just have to think for a moment and say, "Well, hang on a second, that doesn't really work." There's lots of reasons that doesn't work. Now, one of the reasons is simply the nature of visions. So, often when I'm teaching on this, I say to people, "Has anybody here had a vision?" And one or two people in a group of 50 or 60 might put their hands up. I've once or twice had what I would call a visionary experience. I've had more often than that, I've had what I call an auditory experience, where it's almost as if I hear God speaking to me. But the moment we start to say, well, how do we describe that? What language do we use about that? Then first of all, it's very hard. I mean, maybe the closest other example, if you have never had a visionary experience, is when you wake up in the morning, how do you describe a dream? Now, at the time in the dream, it seems really vivid, but start to describe it, and you kind of think, well, there were one or two things were important, but the rest of the detail I'm not sure about. But certainly the thing we do is we use our own language. We use the language of our speech. We use the language of our culture, because that's how we make sense of things. So we can't simply say, oh, this is a vision, this has nothing to do with John, and say that it's disconnected from his culture. He will use his own language, his own cultural language, biblical language we see all the time to do this. And in fact, although this seems strange and he's using pagan mythological language as the framework for what he describes here, in fact, he's done this before. When we go back to the descriptions of heavenly worship in chapters 4 and 5, one of the things I think we see there is this extraordinary blending, a very dense blending of, on the one hand, language and images and ideas from the Old Testament scriptures, his scriptures, sometimes called the Hebrew Bible. So we see a God on a throne, the language of the idea of God being king. We see the rainbow. We see the living creatures from Ezekiel. We see rumblings and thunder and lightning from the Sinai revelation. God's revealing himself to Moses. On the other hand, we see elders there, not priests. They wear gold crowns. They wear white, not the Old Testament colors of worship. And these, and then the chorus says, worthy are you. That's not biblical language. God in the Old Testament isn't called worthy, because that's language you'd use of an exalted person. Yeah, and nice. All of that stuff comes from the Roman imperial cult. So we've already seen a blending of imagery from John's world on the one hand with biblical imagery on the other, and fusing the two in order to say it is the God of Israel who is the only one who deserves the worship which you other people are giving to the emperor. And it's only he who can deliver the peace that the emperor promises and prosperity the emperor promises. So I think we see a similar dynamic here, although the language, because it's borrowing from this Python Leto myth, the language is very different.
Well, I have two thoughts. One is another question. The other one is a bit more glib. I'm thinking about the difference between Anglican and Charismatic Church, and when you asked your congregations if any of you had a vision, maybe two raised their hand. I think in our congregation there'd probably be two people who didn't raise their hand. But
oh, okay.
Difference between church traditions.
Yeah.
So on the subject of Leto and the Python, can you just tell us a bit about this myth? Where would John have heard this myth? What was this myth? Who are some of the big figures within it? And why is he using it within this vision report?
Well, I've got a version here. It's actually quite short in this version, so I think it's okay to read it. Would that be okay just to read it out?
Absolutely.
This is from a collection, a chap called Hyginus, who made a collection of myths. I think this was number 124 in his collection. You can read this online. It's easily accessible. Python, the son of Terra, was a huge dragon. He was accustomed to giving oracles on Mount Parnassus before the time of Apollo. He was informed by an oracle that he would be destroyed by the offspring of Leto. At that time, Zeus was living with Leto. When Zeus's wife Hera heard of this, she decreed that Leto should give birth at a place where the sun does not reach. When Python perceived that Leto was pregnant by Zeus, he began to pursue her in order to kill her. But by order of Zeus, the north wind, Aquilo, lifted Leto up and carried her to Poseidon. Poseidon protected her, but in order not to rescind Hera's decree, he carried her to the island Ortygia and covered the island with waves. And Python did not find Leto, and so he returned to Parnassus. But Poseidon returned the island Ortygia to the upper region, and it was later called the island of Delos, which is the island right next to Patmos, where John is. There, holding onto an olive tree, Leto gave birth to Apollo and Artemis. Of course, the temple of Artemis is in Ephesus, to whom Hephaestus gave arrows as a gift. 4 days after they were born, Apollo avenged his mother. He went to Parnassus and killed Python with arrows. Now, there's three things I think are really interesting about this myth. One is, I think most ordinary readers reading Revelation chapter 12, they go, what? What? Sorry, a woman is pregnant, a dragon stands before her, the dragon wants to eat the baby that she's going to give birth to, but the baby is snatched away. And you're thinking, this is just kind of weird.
Yeah, there's a sense in which everything in Revelation thus far, even
is kind of weird. Okay,
yeah, but even if you want to make a bad interpretation, you can kind of use the scriptures to do it. I mean, you're looking at
Yeah,
11, you're looking at
yeah,
10, you
yeah,
can kind of, piece something together, even if it's,
yeah,
way out of the
yeah.
ballpark. But in the case
Well,
of 12, there's this sense that in verse
yeah.
1 or I think verse 7, it's like, what am I reading?
Absolutely, it really is. Now, that's the first experience. But the other really interesting experience I find, again, just with ordinary readers of the Bible, when I read this myth out, they go, "Oh, okay, we recognize this. So here you have a woman who's pregnant. You have a dragon. The dragon wants to consume the child when it's birth. Then the child is snatched away, and the woman is taken to a safe place prepared for her by somebody else, by a divine figure. And then now this is the interesting bit. The child, when they're born, in this case Apollo, is given arrows, and the child kills the dragon, and the dragon was going to eat the child. So the tables are turned. You go, okay. Now that last little bit looks like it's missed off in Revelation 12, but we'll come back to that. But it is fascinating that people immediately see the connection. Now, this is stuff I'd spent time with in my PhD for 3 years. And so I did do a quite a careful literary structure analysis so you can see the corresponding points. But actually, you just need to read the two together and you recognize them.
Yeah.
But here's a third thing. I mean, you said, how would you know this? Well, we know from documentary evidence, we know that this myth, it was circulated in a number of different forms. It was quite popular in Egypt, and there the gods were Egyptian gods. From the 2nd century BC, we know this circulated through what we now call the Middle East, through into Greece, certainly around to Turkey, and we know it was well known at least until the 3rd century. But here's the really funny thing. I was teaching on this earlier this year, in Derby, which is a city adjacent to us. It's like kind of it's your Denver to Fort Collins. No, it's much nearer than that. It's only 50 minutes drive away. And I read the story out, and everyone went, "Oh, okay." And I said, "I bet you've never heard this." And the woman in the back said, "I know this story really well." I said, "How come?" She said, "I live in Cyprus." She'd come over to the UK, and she's got relatives here. She said, "Everyone in Cyprus knows this story. It's still circulated in amongst the Greek-speaking community as a
Oh,
well-known myth." So it's kind of like, now, this is where I don't know, there's a cultural divide between the UK and the US. And I would sort of talk about Little Red Riding Hood. Is that a story Little Red Riding Hood?
yep.
Or Goldilocks and the Three Bears?
Yep, absolutely.
So those
Uh,
kind of stories. So, if I said to you, "Oh, there was a young girl and she was wearing a cloak, a red cloak with a hood, and she was given apples to take to her grandma in the forest, and then Jesus came out and hit the wolf over the head with a cross." I mean, you'd know what story I was alluding to, because it's,
or,
it's in the
in
air
North
we breathe.
we would have the story of Bunyan the lumberjack and the blue ox. That would be an
Okay.
American folk story that would float around
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Perhaps
That
I
was, I
should
don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, perhaps I should have been a bit more technical in the confusion because, even when we read this myth and you go to like the Matthew 2 story of Jesus's birth and then the flight to Egypt and the way
Yeah.
that's woven in with the Moses story,
Yeah.
it's kind of easy to go, well, I can piece together Apollo,
Yeah.
Jesus takes
Yeah.
his place. I
Yeah.
can piece together this python, the enemy, the
Yeah.
dragon takes
Yeah.
his place.
Yeah.
But who's this woman? Because you can
Uh-huh.
kind of see maybe Mary could fit the bill, and I know the Catholics and the
Yes, it
Orthodox
is.
would say that, but
It
it
is.
just doesn't fit. And so
No.
there's sort of popular theories where the woman represents the figure of Mary.
Yeah.
Dispensationalism would go to Joseph's vision in Genesis 37 and go, oh no, this is Israel language.
Yeah.
Like when Joseph says, the brothers are the stars
Mm.
bowing down to me,
Mm.
representing the tribes of Israel. The historicists, or maybe this is the hidden church. Well, the medieval church is oppressing the
Mm.
true,
Mm.
genuine believers in
Mm.
Jesus. All those
Mm.
interpretations seem pretty problematic.
Mm.
Where would you land in the midst of that? What would you see as the problems in those interpretations, and how would you interpret the woman within this passage?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Catholic version was the one I was raised with, because of course I was raised a Catholic. And if you look at iconography online, the imageries, then you obviously see Mary as the Queen of Heaven, hence the crown.
Yeah.
We need to be disciplined in our reading and say, well, where is John drawing this material from? And we can see the elements that he's drawing from the Apollo Leto myth. But actually, we can if we read carefully, we can also see very clearly where he's drawing the other parts, the characters. The story comes from the Apollo, but the characters consistently come from Scripture. And when we get to the middle of the chapter, we know that because this dragon figure we're told is Satan and the serpent and the accuser of the brethren and all that kind of language there. And in fact, we can find the same with the woman and the male child, and for a couple of reasons. One is that yes, you do have the Joseph story, and so you get the sun and the moon, possibly Joseph's parents. You get the 12 stars, the brothers who end up forming the basis of the tribe. But the language of the woman in the pains of childbirth is also biblical language, and it's used in Isaiah 26, it's used in Isaiah 66, it's used in Micah 2 and Micah 4 as well. And this is a really consistent way of using language about the people of God who are suffering. They're in exile or they're being oppressed. And in fact, in Micah, it's very explicit that the people will be delivered from exile and from oppression as the woman is, or the woman is either the Zion or Jerusalem. And that's the kind of messaging for the whole people of God. And of course, it depends on a pun that works in English, and it works in Greek, and it works in Hebrew, which is we use the word deliver both to mean delivered from trouble, rescued, but also delivered of a child, which
Yeah.
I know is language that you're very aware of these days.
Yep.
Now, one thing I should say is that in Russian and in Kyrgyz, that pun does not work. And I know that because a few years ago I was in Kyrgyzstan, I was teaching this and it was being translated into Russian and to Kyrgyz. And when I explained that, they all looked completely blank. So it is, again, it's a particular cultural and language thing. But this is why it's a natural metaphor, because the pains of childbirth seem like they're never going to end. And then suddenly when they do come and the child is delivered safely, there's extraordinary joy. And it's almost as if the pain that has happened has been forgotten. And this is an image of, what's going to happen with the people of God when the anointed one, Messiah, comes and delivers his people. That's the language we find in Luke chapter 1 in the Benedictus by the hymn of Zechariah, when he's going to come and set his people free. Not from the oppression by the Romans, but from the oppression of sin. And light's going to shine on those who dwell in the shadow of death. So that the anointed one, the Savior who's going to come from Judah, from Benjamin, is going to deliver his people both from sin and from death and set them free. So this is why it's kind of a natural metaphor. And actually, if you look at the Greek text, the description of the woman matches word for word the description we find in the Old Testament. And the same's true in a description of the child. It's a very odd phrase, which English translations smooth out. It's actually called a male son. Now, sons are male, so it's a redundant term, but it matches the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, referring to the one who will rule the nations with an iron rod in Psalm 2. So we can see very clearly those Old Testament sources. So here we have a picture of the people of God from whom the Messiah will come, and this Messiah will deliver them. And of course, as you pointed out, you get this inversion of the myth now. You see, the really significant thing about this myth for John and his first readers was that this was a myth that Roman emperors used, and particularly the Emperor Domitian. And what they said is, I am Apollo, and the conquest of the empire is the thing that gives you peace and prosperity. Outside the empire is this chaos monster, Python, whatever form he takes. And I am the one who will keep you safe from this. And of course, then what John is saying is, no, it's exactly the opposite. It's exactly the opposite. That, and as we discover in chapter 13, it's actually the Roman imperial power is actually being used by the dragon figure, by Satan, to oppress the people of God, to trample them, the heaven dwellers. And it's Jesus who's the Prince of Peace.
Yeah. And in the same way that this myth isn't all that distant, or at least the way John's using this myth isn't all that distant from Isaiah and the Psalms. It's not that distant from the way Paul speaks when he talks about Christ is going to come and grow within you. And then at the end of the age, he's going to deliver you.
Yeah.
And perhaps we just need to have a more broad lens where we get too caught up in the details, and then it's easy to start making up theories instead of looking at the whole picture.
Yeah, I think you're referring now to Galatians 4:19, where it's really fascinating. Paul says, I mean, it's a very mixed metaphor. I am in the pains of childbirth, Paul, until Christ be formed in you. So it's a sort of a double image of birth. So Paul's the one in the pains of childbirth, and yet Christ is the one who's born in us. And it is a bit of a weird, when you think about it, it's a weird metaphor, but I mean, there are some weirder metaphors
Yeah, he
around.
loves to talk about putting on armor and then childbirth, and it's like,
Yeah.
Paul, you got to pick a
Yeah.
metaphor here. All over the
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
So I know as we get into verses 7 and onward, the chapter itself begins to give us the answers to our interpretive questions. We see this
Absolutely.
war in heaven. We see the enemies
Absolutely.
thrown down. We see that this
Yeah.
is where
Yeah.
the salvation of God comes
Yeah.
from.
Yeah.
What would you say as we're looking, particularly at the beginning of this chapter and this strange myth? What are the takeaways for us as a church today? What are we to do with Revelation 12? What do you think it was speaking to the original 7 churches which read this letter, and what do you think it's speaking to us today?
Well, it's really interesting in terms of, again, we've been learning to look carefully at the text, but also been learning to look at it in ways perhaps we're not used to, which is actually looking at the structure of the text. Now, we began the conversation by saying, well, why is it here? And I think it's really interesting in terms of the big picture structure of the book of Revelation. There's a sense in which, right at the very beginning, we kind of get a clue to what this book is about. It's a revelation of Jesus Christ. It's about God who was and is to come, not who will be, but is to come. So there's going to be an end to human history. And then Jesus is the firstborn from the dead, the ruler of the kings of the earth. And he's the one who has freed us by his blood. And we're going to become a kingdom of priests worshiping him. And so there's quite a compressed summary of what we're focusing on. And then we get these themes through the first half of the book about there's conflict, there's suffering. We know that because John says he's our brother in tribulation, and that we're witnesses. So this is what chapter 11 is all about. Yes, the people of God are like Moses, people of God are like Elijah, but this is a description of us as faithful witnesses, because biblically you have to have two witnesses who agree. So we are the faithful witnesses. But here's the thing, and you had that interlude in chapter 7 about the people of God and who we are, which I came and spoke about with you. But here's the thing, what is our testimony? What is the message that we have to share? What is it that we're staying faithful to? And I think there's quite a strong sense in the first half of the book that is kind of hinting at it, but not making it explicit. It's pointing towards it, but we're not quite sure what it is. You know, when the saints under the altar said, "How long, O Lord? What are you going to do about the way the world is?" We kind of get some partial answers until we get to chapter 12. And I think this is why we have this structural break, because chapter 12 says, okay, this is it. This is the answer. Yes, God's called a people to himself. Yes, he's called people to be faithful. But faithful to what? The answer is faithful to this message that Jesus is the one who defeats the powers of sin and darkness. He's the one who's won the victory. And that's why the second observation about structure is that this chapter is very clearly structured. We have the first section with the Apollo-Leto myth. Then in verse 7, a complete change, again, quite discontinuous. We introduced Michael, who in both Daniel and other Jewish apocalyptic literature is the champion of Israel. He's the one to whom the victory is delegated, and he expels Satan. But of course, although we are heaven dwellers with Christ, Ephesians chapter 1, we are also still dwellers on the earth. So this is where we face opposition. And therefore, then you get unfolding of how this conflict is going to unfold until we get to chapter 21 and the revelation of the final realization of that victory. So what does it mean for us? Sorry, that's a long way round of saying what the takeaway is. The takeaway is, look, you feel small and marginalized. You feel oppressed. You can see that this mighty empire and all its myths and all its force, its power, its legions seem to be ranged against you. But actually here at the center, Jesus has won the victory. Jesus has thrown down Satan. Jesus has thrown down the one who accuses you. And just like in Romans 8 verse 1, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ. And that's where the third section of this again shifts into this hymn. And the fascinating thing at the center of this hymn is they have won the victory. How? By two things: by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. So the victory has been won by Jesus, that cosmic victory on the cross and his resurrection. But that victory needs to become real for each of us. And that connects right back to the messages in chapters 2 and 3, because at the end of that, of course, it says, to the one who conquers. And we don't really know what conquering means there until we get to chapter 12. What does conquering mean? Conquering means by your faithful witness, participating in the cosmic victory that Jesus has won for us. And then the rest of the book plays out, okay, as we stay faithful, despite all these challenges, how is it going to come to an end?
Yeah. Um, that's a great summary. And even we talked about the danger of over spiritualizing the seven churches because these are real people with real
Yeah.
problems. They're on the very track you would take if you were going down a Roman highway visiting each of these churches. But I think it's
Mm,
interesting as we see the two witnesses as this picture of the whole people of God.
mm.
Even going back to the beginning of the letter, there's really only two churches, which at the present time then were not compromising
Yeah. Yeah.
witness. And I think it's easy to look back and go, oh, how could they compromise their witness? But it's like
Mm.
5 out of 7 churches were compromising their witness because life is
Yeah.
hard. It's
Yeah.
easy to become discouraged. It's easy to
Yeah.
let accusation and
Yeah.
sin
Yeah.
and compromise flow in. And so
Yeah.
as we look at these grand pictures, to me, it gives me great comfort because in the
Mm.
midst of the kind of banal, difficult, just problems of life, here's
Yeah.
this invitation to go, you're a part of this enormous
Yeah. Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Don't lose heart.
Yeah.
Jesus has won. He is winning and he will
Yeah.
win. Hold
Yeah.
fast to your testimony. So thanks so much for sharing with us. This has been awesome.
Great
Um,
to be with you.
yeah, I hope to do it with you again, and we'll
Mm.
see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks very much.